the angel of the Lord to look at in Judges. We've just looked at the fact that the Judges really is a cycle of rebellion and discipline and deliverance, and then that all over again. And there's one more theme we want to look at in the book of Judges, and that's the theme of the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh. And this is a very interesting theme in the Old Testament. Now, the background for this is Exodus chapter 33, if you want to take a look at this. Israel has sinned in making the golden calves while Moses is up on the mountain. You remember that? And he is, when he comes down, God talks to Moses, and he says this at the beginning of chapter 33. He says, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to your descendants. And I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite and the Amorite and the Hittite and so forth. Go up to the land." And when the people heard these grave tidings, why grave tidings? They mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the children, you're a stiff-necked people. I could come up into your midst in one moment and consume you. So take off your ornaments. Don't be joyous and happy, that I may know what to do with you." And basically the indication he gives here is, I'm not going with you anymore. I'll send my angel. Well, they didn't understand what that was, and so they're concerned about this. So Moses says to the Lord, this is verse 12 of chapter 33. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray, if I found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight. And you consider, this nation is your people." And he, that is the Lord, said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And so Moses says to the Lord, "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. For how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? So we shall be separate, your people, I, and all the people who are on the face of the earth." And Lord said to Moses, "I will also do this thing that you have spoken. You have found grace in my sight." And so there's this whole conflict here. There's this whole thing with the fact that they have already broken the covenant that they're in the process of making by making these golden calves and worshiping them. Moses is on the mountain. He comes down, the tablets are broken. And so all of a sudden it seems like God is saying, I can't be present among this people. I'm not going to go with you. You go up. And Moses says, wait a minute, if you don't go with us, what's the sense in going on? And so he says, my presence will be with you. And, he says specifically there, I will send my angel before you. Now, angel just means messenger. It's just a kind of a vanilla word that means messenger. And it can be a human messenger, somebody you send with a message to someone else. But it comes to have a special significance in the Scriptures with regard to those spirit beings whom God uses for certain functions. And this being called the angel of the Lord, Malach Yahweh in Hebrew, is this special person. And so the background of this really is in Exodus. It's really in the crisis of the presence of God among the people. And we see that God promises He will be with them, but He mediates His presence in numerous ways. Moses was God present in one sense for the people. And when we get to the book of Judges, we find this being the same with regard to this certain individual. So just want to look through this concept, and it's interesting that it occurs in the book of Judges. One of the most negative books, the book that has as sort of the theme of it, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In that book, we find this very interesting figure of the angel of the Lord. We see that this person appears in bodily form. We see this in Judges 6. I have some of the text of Judges 6 here. This is Gideon. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites." Remember, they were, on the run from all these people who would come in and take their crops and so forth. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." And Gideon said to him, "O my Lord, if the Lord is with us." Now notice there, "O my Lord," the first one is in lowercase. So it's Adonai. And the second one is in all uppercase, Yahweh. So, "O Adonai, O my master, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? But now Yahweh has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." And then Yahweh turned to him and said, whoa, what a shift. And so we see that while this man or this person looks to be a man, yet we find that he is, he appears in bodily form, and yet he identifies himself with God. He identifies himself with God, yet remains distinct from him. And we see this in these passages, both in chapter 6, in chapter 13. We won't look at chapter 13, but we will look at chapter 6. And he exercises the prerogatives of God. He exercises the prerogatives of God. Yeah, I'll give you a chance to look at that. You might not know how to spell prerogatives. I don't know if I do. Not prerogatives, but prerogatives. Those special prerogatives, the rights, the privileges, the things that a person can properly do, can properly perform. And so he exercises things that really only God can exercise. One of them is he receives worship. And he manifests the divine presence through a number of things. He instructs, he commands, he receives worship, he judges. And so this very interesting personage, and we do find angels appearing in human form in various places in the Bible. Remember, there were 3 that came to Abraham. And initially, they didn't look any different than anyone else. They were mistaken for human beings, simply human beings. Maybe human beings on a special mission, even a mission of God's. And yet, nonetheless, they take the form of human beings. And yet, this particular messenger, this particular manifestation, goes beyond simply an intermediary function, but actually seems to be spoken of and even identified as the Lord by those who encounter him. And so we see this very interesting personage, and this is traced throughout the Old Testament. We find this appearing in a number of places. And just putting all of the scriptures together, what we would call this is a Christophany. A Christophany. Now, a theophany is any appearance of God. A Christophany is simply the appearance of the second person of the Godhead. There is no mention of this person in the New Testament, which would make sense. If Jesus Christ is now incarnate, he is appearing in human form, and you would have 2 people appearing in 2 different bodies. That doesn't work, at least in the Bible. It might work in the movies. But only through the movies. So he's a Christophany, and it is in the best way to handle this is it's an appearance of the second person of the Trinity, in a bodily form in the Old Testament. Now let's just look at this text in Judges chapter 6. We see that the Malach Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh, comes. He sits under the tree. He speaks with Gideon. Gideon addresses him politely as his master and talks to him about the Lord, Yahweh, in the third person. Why has he forsaken us? And then it says in verse 14, Yahweh turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? And very interesting. This is, of course, the narrator telling us it is Yahweh speaking to him. And so he says to him, O my Lord, there's the small master, how can I save Israel? And Yahweh says to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. And when you see that I will be with you, think back to Exodus. God says, I'm not going up with you. And Moses says, if you don't go, and then he says, my presence will go. And so God does manifesting his presence in this person. This text continues, verses 17 of Judges 6. Then he said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. That's strange at that point. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you. Gideon is getting the clue here. Then the angel of Yahweh put out the end of the staff. Now this is after he brings the offering. He tells him what to do with it. The offering is lying there. He puts out the end of his staff that was in his hand, and he touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of Yahweh departed out of his sight. Poof, gone. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said to him, Yahweh said to him, Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to Yahweh and called it the Lord is peace, shalom, well-being. To this day it's still there. So he becomes aware that he is not just speaking with a man, he is not simply speaking with an angelic messenger, he is speaking face to face with God, who has appeared to him in this physical form. And so we see this very interesting manifestation of God. And since he identifies himself with God, yet is distinct from God, talking about God, then we would be reasonable in identifying it as the second member of the Trinity. And you'll remember in Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is talking about the experience of Israel. And he says, Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food. And all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And so we do see the involvement of the second member of the Trinity with the Old Testament people, with Israel in the wilderness and later. And so this theme of the angel of Yahweh carries that idea forward. God is making himself present in a human form, albeit not a permanent human form, not a human form that resulted from a natural birth from a mother, but a manifestation, an appearance. But this very interesting person, and what we're meant to see here is that God is involved with his people. That God does let his presence be known to his people when they need it, in the way that they need it, as he chooses. And so we see the recognition of this. So this is an important theme in the book of Judges. It has a high percentage of occurrence in the book of Judges. It does occur elsewhere in the Old Testament. But interesting, in this most dark period of Israel's early history, we find this person. He's there. He's working with them on God's behalf. Now, the contribution of Judges, just to summarize the book. First of all, It's a demonstration of God's faithful and loving discipline. In Deuteronomy chapters 28 and chapter 30, God said that as a loving father, when they disobeyed him, he would discipline them. He would discipline them for their own good. He would discipline them for the purpose of repentance, so that they might turn back. And so we see it as a loving discipline, and we actually see the outworking of that in the book of Judges. If God were not to do this, then they would just go off on their way, and they would be up to their own devices, and eventually they would be destroyed as a people. So we do see the outworking of Deuteronomy 28 in that regard. But we also see that it's a breakdown of the theocracy. The theocracy. We don't live in a democracy. Democracy is ruled by all of the people. All the people vote on everything. We live in a republic form of government. You know, ocracy at the end of, or ocracy at the end of a word is just explaining some kind of a government. Well, the government that we have here is a theocracy. It's ruled by God. And when we get to Samuel, we're going to see that God says to Samuel when Israel asks a king, say, don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you, but me from being king over them. So the book of Judges, God is their king. God is the ruler. And he rules the people through what, do you suppose? Judges? No. Judges weren't permanent. The judges were just two certain situations of discipline and deliverance. Torah. He rules through Torah. He rules through the law as taught by the Levites and through the whole system that was set up in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And he is there. His presence is represented in the tabernacle. They approach him. And so he's the king. And they are to learn to respond to him as king. But Judges is the failure of this form of government. And that will bring us in the book of Samuel to the need for a king. So it's the breakdown of the theocracy. That is, a government whose direct king is God. Now when we get to the kingdom with David and so forth, God is still the ultimate king, but he'll have a king on earth. That was not the case during this period. And finally, it demonstrated the need for a king. It demonstrated the need for a human ruler, somebody on earth that they could look to, they could respond to, who was in a human form. And this, perhaps this is the reason for the prominence of this angel of Yahweh theme in the book, is that they needed some manifestation of God's presence with them, some assurance that He's right there, He's working. And the king, once the king comes on the scene, would be that kind of a manifestation. So the book of Judges is that transition between the nation actually taking up their inheritance of the land through a very negative period of their not really enjoying that because they did not drive out all the enemies, and yet God still being faithful to work with them. Now, you don't have to read really any farther in the Old Testament to get the idea that Israel is not going to make it in terms of being the obedient people that God says you must be for me to ultimately bless you. But even though that's the case, God isn't going to let them go. And God isn't going to let the whole plan just be destroyed. And really the rest of the Bible is just underscoring that over and over and over and over again. And so we see very clearly the pattern. Now that brings us next to a unique book, the book of Ruth. And it occurs during the period of Judges, as we find in the very first book. And Ruth sort of could be, though there was no king in the country, yet it was not absolutely, totally bad. Because here in Ruth we find a positive contrast in the person of Boaz and the person of the situation and so forth. Now Ruth's a very short book, 4 chapters. We're not going to spend a whole lecture on 4 chapters when we spend 2 days on a book of 52 chapters. It's a survey course. But just note that Ruth occurs in this context of the judges. And it came to pass the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. What would that alert you to? Yeah, no food. That's what a famine means. But theologically, what would that alert you to? Adam? Huh? Deuteronomy 28, yeah. Adam, they've disobeyed. Deuteronomy 28. Good, you're learning. That will be almost the answer that you can just throw out without thinking the rest of this semester and the next semester. Deuteronomy 28. All goes back to Deuteronomy 28. That's it. So he says the first thing that will happen when you disobey me is you will not be blessed in your trough and kneading bowl and produce of your land and so forth. Famine. I'll withhold the rains. And so likely we are to see God's hand of discipline, and it is connected with the book of Judges. So that would bring to mind the idea of failure, of unbelief, of judgment. Failure, unbelief, judgment. These are the things that have been going on in the book of Judges. The book is tied to the book of Judges, and so we see that in that context. And of course, you know the story of a family that removes from the land of Israel because of the famine, goes to Moab. The husband dies, the sons die, the mother is left with 2 daughters-in-law and destitute, and they come back, and it's a story of reversal. Very quickly, just to look at the book, it's a book of contrasts. It's a book of contrasts. At the beginning, you've got judges ruling. At the end, not the end of the story, but the end of the book, through the genealogy, we've got David as king. The mention of David means that this is to be tied somehow to his reign, probably early in his reign as he is being established in the kingdom. So we've got this contrast in terms of the rulers at the beginning and the end. You've got a failed genealogy at the beginning, Elimelech. His house stands to end because of the adversity. A famous genealogy at the end of the book. The genealogy that starts with Boaz and comes down to David. And of course will be continued as David becomes the father of a house of kings. Elimelech, the name means, my God is king. Interesting. Well, if your God is king, why are you leaving the land that the king rules over? And so we see this irony in terms of his name and yet what is happening in the land in general and what his experience is in particular. At the end, we have David, God's chosen king. And so we have this theme of the king at beginning and the end of the book. So Elimelech, my God is king, and yet God is not blessing the land because of the nation's disobedience in the judges. We come to the end, and it mentions David as God's chosen king. Naomi, are there still sons in my womb? I'm destitute. Ruth, you can't come with us. There's no hope with me. And yet, at the end of the book, she is given a son through Ruth, and her family name is continued. Her husband's name is continued. And so we see this great reversal from destitution with regard to having a family to care for her, to having a family. Not only Boaz, but a son to actually, the baby that's born is really considered the son of Elimelech, the son of Naomi. And so we find this great reversal. And then Naomi is bitter at the beginning, and at the end she is blessed. And so a book of contrasts, a book which really is a suitable hinge between Judges and Samuel. though it does not cover the whole history, it does give us this connection point. And so we see this this tiny little book making a significant statement about the fact that God was not totally absent, even as we see in the book of Judges. Now, we've got this Boaz's benediction at the end. All the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman." And so we see Boaz being blessed for his really principled obedience to Torah, to law. He is sensitive to the requirement that widows be taken care of, to the Levitical prescription with regard to the kinsman and the duty of a kinsman. And so he is blessed in this book. And we see the blessing upon Naomi. "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, without a kinsman. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons. Who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Okay? And so Naomi, who experiences great misfortune, really not at her own, for her own sin or for her own deeds. She's taken by her husband there. And we just see this, this negative situation that she has fallen into. And it's a lot like the nation of Israel. And yet it is reversed in a most unusual way, in a most dramatic fashion in this book. And so we see it as a little book, a little gem in the darkness of the disobedience of Israel. And it just shines in terms of the fact that God has a purpose and God has a hope, can give them hope. And this is what we experience. And it does make a suitable connection or hinge between Judges and the books of Samuel. Now we want to start looking at the books of Samuel. Just an overview, and you don't have a place to write this, but just to put in your mind what's going on here. This is a book of 2 arrows. One that goes up from Samuel to David, and the one that goes down from then on. So we're gonna come into the best time in the nation of Israel. And then, beginning with Solomon, we're going to find a negative slide, all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. God is not going to be absent. God is going to be present. But He is going to be present more often in discipline and judgment than He is in the blessing of obedience. Again, it will be the outworking of Deuteronomy 28. Now, you do have this chart, I believe, and you can fill this in, because what we have here, and this just kind of gives a theological overview or flow of the book of Samuel Kings. Remember 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings are the 4 books of the Kings. We start out with Samuel, and Samuel is the last judge. And his sons kind of take over the functions of leadership, but his sons are really failures. And so the nation reacts against this. Now, Samuel's not a bad guy, but his sons are. And so the failure of Samuel represents really the failure of the judges. And so the judges were never intended to be a permanent ruling structure. God had not laid down any kind of qualifications for them. They were simply what He provided to the situation as Israel is under the hand of judgment, the hand of discipline. So Samuel really represents the failure of the judges. And that gives rise to the nation placing hope in a king. And so they will come to Samuel and they will say, we want a king just like the rest of the nations. Samuel reacts to that. The Lord instructs him to go ahead and appoint a king. But the nation sees the failure of the judges. They see that they're going nowhere under this system. And so they think, what we need is a king. All the rest of the nations have kings. Why don't we have a king? You see how far they had gotten away from God's ideal form of government already by this time. God was their king. He lived in their presence. He would fight for them. All of those things that were promised through the Pentateuch and through Joshua, it just hadn't sunken in. We need a king like the rest of the nations have. That will be the key. Well, so God gives them a king. And Saul represents the failure of the requested king. The failure of the requested king. So this is the one they wanted, and he was tall, and he was good looking, and he probably had some military abilities. Hey, we've got a king. Now we're going to be okay. And what happens? They're not okay. Saul blows it. And so that gives rise to hope in an ideal king. And because David replaces Saul, and David is the ideal king, and we will look at that theme when we get to this section. And so it's not just any king. We need a king who has, the ideal qualities that God looks for in a king. And we will see that those are three. Saul had two of them, and David had all three. But David fails as well. And so we find in David the failure of the ideal king. Even he cannot lead the nation in the kind of obedience and the kind of righteousness that is required for them to realize the full promises of Deuteronomy 28, to be put at the head of the nations and to receive God's continual unabated blessing. And so even in David we find a failure. And yet God, through David, he makes a covenant with David. And so the being disappointed with regard to David being the ideal king, their hope comes to be placed in the covenant promised king. Eventually a king will come, and so the dynasty of kings. And so we find in 1 and 2 Samuel that there are these failures that give rise to new hope. And we see that cycle repeating over and over and over again. Well, what about 1 Kings? When we get to 1 Kings, what do we find? Well, Solomon is the failure of the first covenant promised king. Whoops. God has made a covenant, and he says, the son of David will rule over the eternal throne in Jerusalem. Maybe it's Solomon. It's not Solomon. He fails as well. And in fact, as a result of his failure, the kingdom is going to be split. And so now we find despair replacing hope. Despair, because the next thing to look for in regard to the kings and the history of the kings is, the covenant king that will come from the house of David. And so despair over the kingdom. The kingdom is going to be split. The kingdom is going to be torn out of Solomon's hand. And so we don't find hope and a looking forward. And then remember, the arrow goes up to David and then it starts down with Solomon. But increasing despair over the state of the nation, over the state of Israel. And so with the divided kingdom, we find that. So with the kingdom, the failure of the united kingdom leads to despair over the northern captivity. So the united kingdom fails. Eventually the northern kingdom goes into captivity, conquered by the whom? Assyrians. The Assyrians, that's right. In what date? Say it together, 722 BC, all right? Assyrians, 722. Superimpose a 7 on that A somehow for Assyrians. Put a 722 in there somewhere in your minds, and you'll have it. Huh? It's going to stick. You got a 7 sitting there in the little cross thing of the A, and then the SS for the 22s, Assyrians. You got it. Okay, so we've got the kingdom. The kingdom is split. The northern kingdom goes into captivity, and that produces despair. And then the temple, of course, is in the south. It's thought that the temple could never be destroyed. My goodness, how could God ever destroy the temple? And so we see that this is where their hope is placed. But the failure of the southern kingdom, as is evidenced in the temple and the abuse of the temple and the false worship in the temple, results in the temple being destroyed. And so there is despair over the destruction of the temple and the exile. And the exile occurs under what nation? The Babylonians. And that date is 586. Okay? An 8 and a B are very, very similar in their form. 586. The Babylonians. So you got the 8 there superimposed on the B with the 5 hanging out on the left. 586. You got it. Okay. So this really is theologically what is happening in terms of the nation and their state. The judges, God's the king, but they just don't get it. He didn't fail in his leadership. He didn't fail in what he had promised. In fact, he continued to show grace and patience and long suffering with them. And so they request a king, and yet their hope is in a king, but Saul fails, so their hope is placed in the ideal king. David fails. Their hope is placed in the covenant promised king. But Solomon fails. And so then we turn into just a growing despair over the loss of the whole kingdom, the United Kingdom, a despair in terms of the northern kingdom being captive, and then finally a despair which is going to just produce a tremendous crisis of identity, and that is the temple is destroyed. We will see when we next semester we get to that point that the people, that this was unthinkable. Sure, maybe God's going to carry the northern kingdom into captivity, Israel, because they set up false worship at Samaria. That wasn't the place where God said was to be worshipped. They didn't have the temple. They didn't have the Levitical priesthood. They weren't offering rival sacrifices, but we are. God will not destroy his house. Well, guess what? He removes his presence, his glorious indwelling presence from the house, and he does destroy it. In fact, he directs the Babylonians to pull it down brick by brick. Just doesn't come in and burn it. He pulls that down, pulls the walls of the city down. And so we just find this growing despair over everything going wrong. In all of this, God is going to be making comment as to what is going to happen, what will be the outcome of it all, and we will see that he continues to show how he has provided.